Okay. Hi, my name is Larry. Talk a little bit about one of the cars I own, one of my favorites. It's a 1953 XK120. Give you a little bit of a background on Jaguars and the XKs and the 120s, etc., if you're not all that familiar with them. The story kind of starts in 1922 when a British motorcycle enthusiast, Bill Lyons, better known today as Sir William Lyons, but let's say Bill Lyons at the time, young Bill, wanted to go in business for himself and decided, since he was a motorcycle enthusiast, he's going to produce sidecars for motorcycles. And he started doing that in 1922 and continued doing that for about 4 years and was very successful at it. The company grew to the point that in 1926 decided so good at building sidecars, had the capacity, the ability to build bodies for other cars, be a coach builder. And so he started doing these special coach built car bodies for other companies like Austin and Fiat. They were better looking than the factory bodies that those companies produced. And again, he was quite successful at that. So they were Fiats or Austin with the swallow bodies on them. And it continued that for about 5 years until around 1931, decided, maybe he would build his own cars. Had the capacity to build the bodies and everything else, but except for engines. He hadn't produced any engines and decided to go to an outside company, another car company, to get the engines for these cars. And there was a company by the name of Standard, the Standard Car Company, who contracted with him to provide him with engines. And so therefore he started building cars with these standard engines and swallow bodies. Standard Swallows, called the company SS, short for Standard Swallow. And did that until 1940 when the war broke out, and at that point there's no more car production. But the engineers, etc., hung around the factory, and the fact is they were in the evenings and at night on the roof of the factory looking out for German bombers. They were called fire watch because the Germans were dropping bombs all over London at the time, even though this was Coventry and they were getting their share as well. But nonetheless, they were up on the roof, and while they were all there together, they started talking about what are they going to do after the war, and wouldn't it be nice to have a new car with a brand new engine? So what should we do? They decided why not draw up some experimental engines and see where that went. So they started an X series of engines, X for experimental. And the first draft was using alphabetical XA, and they come up with a design for that, and then they modified it, and etc., and it was XB and then XC. And they kept going until they got something that looked like it would work perfectly, exactly what they liked. And by that time, it was at the alphabet K, so it was the XK. And they actually went down to the factory floor in 1943, and they built a prototype XK. And that's essentially what's in this car. It's a straight six dual overhead cam engine, alloy head. It's a Hemi, and 3.4 liter. And that's basically what they produced in 1943. Didn't really produce it at that point, but they had their prototype, etc. And when the war was over in 1948, they decided, let's build a new car and use this engine. So they started with a sports car. And they developed a sports car that they were pretty sure with this engine could do 120 miles an hour. They made that the name of the car, the XK120. And they produced those cars from 1948 to 1954. But from 48 on, they weren't sure whether the public would be all that interested in them, so they were hand-built. They built 242 of these cars, all hand-built, all aluminum bodies, and they got so many orders for them, they decided to, in the early 1950, to go into production with the steel-bodied cars. Cars that are steel-bodied like this one, but they're a little misnomer because all of the Jaguar 120s have aluminum hoods, aluminum doors, and aluminum trunks, even though they are steel bodied. So we'll take a closer look at this one. Before I get into the details on this particular car, let's go back again to, it was named the XK120 based on the estimated top speed of this car out of the showroom. And back in 1949, they decided to prove the point. So they took a Roadster, because that's all they were building at that time, was what the English call open two-seater, which is a Roadster. And they took it over to Belgium. They closed off a highway in Belgium and did a two-way, 1 mile, two-way run on 1 mile. And all they did with that Roadster is they removed the windshield. And that gave them an extra 12 miles an hour. They did 132 miles an hour with the windshield removed, which proved the point that, yeah, this was a pretty fast car back in 1949. In 1950, they actually went to a circular track, no straightaways or anything, just a circular track, and they wanted to prove the durability and reliability of this engine. So they ran it for 24 hours, stopped to change tires and to fuel up the car, and after 24 hours, they averaged 107 miles an hour during that 24 hours, non-stop except for tires and fuel. So again, it proved that the engine was a solid, durable, reliable engine. And further, in 1951, they took a stock XK120, ran it at Le Mans, basically in racing trim only, and they finished 11th overall at Le Mans in 1951, and actually averaged 132 miles again because of the straightaways at Le Mans, which allowed them to go a little faster than you would on a circular track. So that's kind of the performance characteristics of this car, etc. Again, I mentioned with the alloy Roadsters, they started with the steel-bodied cars. Again, Roadsters in 1950, and up until 51, they started with what they call a fixed head coupe. We would just call it a coupe here, but this is what this car is. And they built the 120s again right up to 54. So the fixed head coupe, which unlike the Roadster has roll-up windows, etc., and air conditioning and all that. Well, air conditioning, it's got vents that bring air in and kick up the dust that's in the carpets, give you the good breathable air inside the car. But at any rate, fixed head coupes came into being in 1951, and they built just under 3,000 of these, about 2,600. The Roadsters overall, from 48 until 54, they built just under 8,000 of those. And then in 1953, they came out with what they call a drop head coupe. In other words, it was a coupe, except what we would refer to as a convertible. It had roll-up windows, which the Roadster does not have. The Roadster has a very flimsy fabric top, which you can take apart and put behind the seats or throw in the trunk. The drop head coupe is a true convertible with a thick convertible top that folds down behind the seats, etc. And basically just a coupe with a top that came down. So those are the three variations of the 120. I bought this car in 1977 from a fellow in Portland. He was not a Jaguar enthusiast, but he was an enthusiast of this specific car. It was a year old. He bought it out of California, and it's still a low mileage car. I think it's got under 40,000 miles on it. So it gets driven cars and coffee, etc., but never taken on any long tours or anything. It's a very capable car, though. And what he was interested, he was a sheet metal worker, so he looked at it, loved it, but he saw, you know, there are some things about this car that he felt he could improve on a little bit, quote unquote. So, okay, here's some examples, starting at the front. If you're looking for a used XK120, one of the things you find on a lot of the used cars is right about here on the fender. it'll be a crease. And the reason is that the bumpers are attached to the fender, and if you hit anything at all with your bumper, it's going to cause a crease in the fender. He thought that was not a good way to build these cars, so what he did, he detached essentially the mounting points of the bumpers so that they're not actually totally attached to the fender, and if you hit them, they will go in and out of the fender without affecting the sheet metal of the fender. So that's somewhat unique, I guess, and one of the things he did. He also looked at the interior of the car, the doors. They have very wide doors, and again, if you have used one of these, one of the first things you'll notice, the hinges for the doors are typically a little bit weak, and the doors have a tendency to fall an inch or so when you open it. So he thought that was not a good thing. So he modified it, and you can actually rock the whole car using this door because he strengthened the hinges and so that it's just solid as could be. Additionally, they're very wide doors. And he thought, my goodness, this wide, what could you do with that? And he, from the side of the door, actually built a pocket where you could put whatever you wanted to stash. I would consider, an owner's manual, a map, or whatever turns you on that you don't want anybody else to see, you could stash inside the door. He did that on both doors. But the most fascinating and incredible thing that he did was the window crank and the door handle. They're in just the opposite positions of where they normally would be. But it's the exact same spots except reversed. So this would be the door handle, this would be the window crank in those exact same spots. He changed them. Well, obviously, all the mechanical aspects on the interior of the door had to be altered, which he did. And he only did that because he preferred to open the door reaching towards the front of the door on the inside than having the window crank closer to his body. So that was the main thing. Also, these doors did not come with a armrest. These came originally out of a much larger sedan, but they were bigger than this. He just cut them down the side. Again, he was a sheet metal worker, and this was a piece of cake for him. So that's one of the things he did, was cut those, made them smaller so they'd fit right here. But normally you wouldn't have these on a 120. Also, being a sheet metal worker, the floors on these, if you took them apart, were originally made out of wood. Well, he thought that's not good. That'll rot and eventually come apart. So out came the floors, and he replaced them with metal. So they're metal floors. And these are some of the small touches that he made, including the seat frames, which are usually flush to the floor. He raised them slightly so the air would go underneath the seats and prevent moisture from being captured under there, creating any kind of rust or anything. So this was kind of typical. Also, he made some changes behind the seats where we have what used to be places for 2 batteries, because it's a 12-volt car, but it came with 2 6-volt batteries that were linked in tandem. And he altered that to a single 12-volt, so you have an extra space there where there used to be a battery. Yeah, a couple of things here. Notice a lot of today's cars, modern cars, have what this had way back when. When you turn the key on, all you're doing is turning on the electricals, the ignition. It doesn't start the car. What do cars have today? A lot of them, push button, and this is what this had in 53. This is your starter up here. So you just turn the key to get the juices going. Here's what starts it up here. I always found this a little bit odd, that the handbrake lever was, the mechanicals of it was wide open where you could see it if you're sitting over on that other side. It didn't make any sense to me. Then it dawned on me as to why that is. Because in England, this would be a right-hand car, the steering wheel would be over here, the handbrake lever would be on this side, and this would not be exposed, it would be buried behind the tunnel here. So that's the reason they just didn't bother to make a whole new one and to get a whole different one for the left-hand drive. So you've got your right-hand drive handbrake lever with the exposed mechanicals because they just moved it from one side of the car to the other. So this car normally comes with a glove box that you've got here, and it comes with a drawer here. But if you have a radio-equipped car, and the last fellow that owned this, he bought a radio for it and replaced the drawer with the radio. So this is where the drawer would be that comes out that you could put things. And the other thing he did, normally your rear mirror here, which is for little tiny people, little tiny mirror, it's mounted on the dash, and he wanted a little higher up, so removed it and put it up here, which is actually a much better location. And the other thing, sometimes if you're watching TV on car shows, etc., there's things that they promote that are kind of interesting to me. They promote these visors that are made of plastic that you can put down in the sun. This is factory. This is 1953 factory to keep the sun from hitting your eyes. Way back in 53. I'll have to tighten up later. The other thing too is the steering wheel is movable in and out. Now, you do it by twisting, but it's also up and down, but you need a wrench to do that. So it's adjustable steering column, in and out, up and down. Ahead of its time. And again, little touches. Let me give you an example here. This is where your gas cap goes, you know, here. And you can open this. This is not from the factory. Put this here. So guess what? You're gassing up your car. If you dribble a little bit, I'm talking about the gas cap, not you, but if there's a little dribble, it'll fall on here and not on the paint. So again, little minor touches, and this car is full of these that he felt were improvements over what the factory did. Right down to the back. This section back here where the license plate goes is generally about this deep, this far apart. It's very, very wide because the British have very large license plates. And you thought, well, I don't need that here. So what did he do? He cut them and shortened them so it didn't look so wide. The backup license plate light, normally on a factory car, I'm not sure why they did this, but they had the wiring for the light actually exposed. It came through here and you could see the wiring, and that's how the factory built them. Yeah, that wasn't very good. So he created a little bit of bracket and used a pipe and ran the wiring through the pipe so it wasn't exposed. And lastly, the beading between the fender and the body from the factory is fabric. And it's exactly like this. You can't tell it apart. This is not the factory beading. But being fabric, over time, it will come apart. I mentioned this guy was a sheet metal worker. So guess what? This is a metal beading. It'll last forever, but it's exactly the same size, and I defy you to tell it apart from the fabric beading. Exactly the same. Anyway, I've had this car since '77. I love it. It's a great little cruiser. It's fast. The only detriment is that the brakes are original and stock. The 1953 brakes, they work great as they did in '53. They don't work so well today. So you have to keep your distance because it is a pretty fast car, and with the braking, with today's modern speeds, etc., you want to keep your distance. Anyway, that's the story of my 1953 XK120 fixed head coupe. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background into the car company that built this car, and it occurred to me that maybe I skipped over one of the more important aspects of the SS company, which occurred when the war ended in 1945. Up to that time, it was As you recall, started with the Swallow Sidecar Motorcycle Company, building sidecars. Then the coach building with the Swallow Coachwork, and then finally their own cars, standard Swallows with the standard engines. So the SS Car Company, right up through the war, up until 1945. But then, by that point, as you can imagine, the Nazis had done a pretty good job of promoting SS, and it had some dire connotations. So the car company decided maybe it was time for a change. Now, one of their models in the 30s was an SS Jaguar that they call a particular model. And they decided, let's change the name of the company from SS to Jaguar. There might be a better direction and get away from that horrible SS connotation that the Nazis provided. At any rate, that was in March of 1945. The other thing that was consequential for Jaguar about that time was that the English economy had gone in the dumps, and the government was hurting for funds for incoming cash, which they didn't have any. So to solve that, they initiated some tax incentives for companies to produce their products and sell them overseas to kind of bring monies back into England. And so Jaguar took advantage of that, and when they produced the XK120, very few were actually sold in England. Most of them were exported, a bulk of them to the United States, and the majority of those to California, where a lot of celebrities and movie stars and professional people became owners of these cars. In fact, this particular car was originally purchased in California, and from there it went to Oregon, as I had mentioned previously, and then I bought it in Oregon and now resides in Arizona with me. Now, okay, I'm no Jay Leno, but I have owned a number of cars. I have owned a whole lot, a numerous number of XK120s, so including the first left-hand drive, the 24th left-hand drive of the first 242 alloy cars. So I had that car and a number of other 120s, including fixed head coupes like this one. The first one actually I bought when I was in a service over in France and Paris. So I've had a number of these, and hopefully you found my pointing out things about this car that might have been of interest to you. Maybe other cars I've owned might be of interest to you, or my time that I spent with Chevrolet and my experiences with not just cars but in motorsports. And if that's of any interest to you, let me show you something. I wrote a book on the subject, Lobsters in the Snow. There's 50-odd short stories in there that include my exploits with various cars, and as I said, motorsports, and the Chevrolet Motor Division. After all, I was a merchandising manager for Chevrolet. Maybe that's how I got the ability to promote my book as part of this video. At any rate, again, I want to thank Dick Cecil B. DeMille for doing this video of mine. I'm not sure what his motive is or what his intent is, but he kept persuading me that he wanted a video of this particular car and some of my other cars, so we'll see how that goes. But again, thank you, Dick, for taking the time, and hope this is worthwhile for whatever your endeavors are.